IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. It is Tuesday. I feel like I haven't seen y'all in a while. I haven't seen y'all since Friday. I've missed you guys. I hope that you've missed me. I'm ready to have some fun today. We're going to talk Notre Dame offensive line. About the only thing that can get me more fired up than talking about quarterbacks is talking about the offensive line. And it's a big year for Notre Dame. And so we're going to do sort of our State of the Union type of discussion about the offensive line today. So we'll talk about the offensive line coming out into the 2024 season. And we'll also talk about the offensive line as we look forward to the future. And those are things that we're going to discuss today. I'm also going to talk about I'm going to have some fun. I think it'd be kind of fun for us to dive into a conversation about what are the best offensive lines been at Notre Dame the last 10 years, and then where will this line stack up with that group. And I'm going to go through from 2014 to 2013, rank those 10 offensive lines as the 10 I see best, and then talk about what the floor and the ceiling might be for this Notre Dame offensive line when we talk about I'll talk about that during the O-line section, and then also talk about where the floor and ceiling is in regard to where it would stack up along the last 10 offensive lines that Notre Dame has had. And obviously Notre Dame has had some great ones in that stretch, and they've had some bad ones in that stretch, and then stuff in between. So where's this offensive line going to be? Is this going to be one of the better ones? Is it going to be in the top half of the last decade? Will it be in the bottom half? And why is there such a range? Then we'll look into the future. What's the future of the offensive line look like? And how is the 24 season going to tell us so much about what the future looks like? Going to also do a little film room today, and I just wanted to keep it a full offensive line show today. So what I'm going to do during the film breakdown session is I'm going to look at the two offensive linemen on the board that maybe we don't talk as much about, and that is going to be Will Black and Matty Augustine. We've broken down Owen Strebig. We've talked a lot about his film, and so we'll do him kind of another time. But today we're going to talk about Matty Augustine and Will Black, who have a very unique rankings profile. And I'll dive into what I like about those two players. And just, obviously that'll tie into some of the looking down the road. What does the future look like, and that type of conversation. So I'm going to have some fun today. You guys want to have some O-line conversation in the chat, that would be great. When I get to the rankings, I am definitely counting on you all in the chat to give me your feedback. I want to know what your ranking is, so you have time to prepare. Probably maybe at least 30 to 45 minutes. You have time to prepare your rankings 2014 to 2023. What is your ranking for the top 10 offensive lines? I'll give you mine, so I want to hear yours. And if you want to criticize mine, I want to see yours. If you want to praise mine, I still want to see yours. Make it fun, and we'll have some conversation today. And I'm I see someone in the chat. I have a different ranking than what I think maybe a lot of people are going to think when it comes to the number one group, but we'll dive into that during the show today as well. And so that folks is the idea of what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to have some fun. I love talking about offensive line, but this is a very important topic. And when we look at the 2024 football team and we discuss, how good is Notre Dame going to be? How good can Notre Dame be? And we talk about quarterback and wide receiver and safety and, will the young linebacker step up? Is Viper going to be better? Can they replace the production at big end? What's Mitchell Evans' health? There's all these things that we can discuss about what is going to hold this team back or what is going to fuel this team's success. But for me, the offensive line is going to be the key. The offensive line really playing to as close to its potential as possible is going to be key for this offensive line. And I'm very much looking forward to diving into that. So that'll be the topic du jour today. We're going to talk about some other position groups as we get in towards the late tomorrow and then on Thursday. I'm going to keep kind of working through the different position groups with the State of the Union type approach. Going to have some other fun topics this week as well. Bryan Smith is planning to join me tomorrow. We're going to talk about defensive back recruiting and we'll talk about the players that are in the class, which we've done a lot. We'll talk about the potential finish, which we've talked a lot about. But then he and I are going to have some nostalgia. We're going to look at how defensive back recruiting has gone over the years for Notre Dame. And he and I are going to go all the way back to the Lou Holtz era and really talk about, why it's been a trouble position for Notre Dame at times. Why has it been successful at times for Notre Dame? and what is allowing them to have the success they're having now. And we're going to get into all that. So this is going to be a lot of fun today. So I'm looking forward to it. So that is our agenda today for the show. Let's kick things off actually with one little note before we dive into offensive line play. If you haven't seen, the opener for Notre Dame has now been established from a broadcast start time and a channel time. So despite there being Florida, Miami, despite there being Clemson, Georgia on TV on the opening weekend, the primetime ABC game will be Notre Dame at Texas A&M. The broadcast is going to start at 7:30, which means the kickoff will be probably around 7:37 Eastern. It's going to be on ABC, which most likely means that we get Chris Fowler and Kirk Herbstreit. So just a reminder of why I'm glad that I'm there and don't have to listen to the broadcast. I'm sorry I couldn't help myself. And also College Game Day will be in College Station for that game. So pretty impressive for an irrelevant Notre Dame football program, wouldn't you say? I mean, you've got a team that's barely in the top 20 in Texas A&M and another team that's not even in the top 36, according to some people. So I say all in jest. But it's going to be a huge matchup. And I think the uniqueness of this matchup plays into why this decision is being made. You know, we've seen several Clemson, Georgia games over the last 10, 15 years. See Florida, Miami. Neither of them are highly ranked programs right now. You're going to have Notre Dame and Texas A&M, both preseason top 25 teams. Notre Dame has not traveled to Texas A&M since 2001. And so we're going to have some fun breaking that series, that matchup down, and as we preview it this summer. And then, of course, as we get into opening week and we preview, that matchup. It's a huge opening game for Notre Dame. And so that's going to be that's obviously big. If you're going to be down there, you see the College Game Day stuff. But I think this segues perfectly into the play of the offensive line. And, you know, what I feel a lot of times is if you want to really be a successful road team, you have to have a strong offensive line. It's great to have skill and it's great to have a big quarterback, but the best thing that you can do when you go to another team stadium with 100,000+ people screaming, night game, all that, is to just go out there and physically kick their butt. And so Notre Dame is going to have to be able to handle what is going to be a very talented Texas A&M defensive line. So what kind of offensive line is Notre Dame going to have? Well, as we kick this off, I mean, I really think it comes down to, I don't know. But I'll say this. If Notre Dame is going to be able to compete with and beat Texas A&M, if it's going to be able to beat Florida State, if it's going to be able to beat Louisville and USC and go into the postseason and make a run, they have to be good up front. They don't have to be the very best offensive line in the country, but they have to be good. Notre Dame is always a program that is at its best when it has a strong offensive line. There's very few Notre Dame teams over the last 30 years, 40 years since I've been a fan that you look at and say, well, that was a great Notre Dame team, but man, they had a really shaky offensive line. When Notre Dame has a great offensive line, they've at least got a shot to have a great football team. And that's so important because it's a position you can recruit well at Notre Dame. It's a position you can recruit the North extremely well. You can recruit the Northeast very well, the Midwest. You can go down into different parts of the country and sell your pedigree about what you're able to do. So you're able to go out to California and get an Aaron Banks, for example, when that need arises. But you look at a lot of the great offensive linemen Notre Dame has had the last 15, 20 years. You've had some out of region. Ronnie Stanley is from Nevada. You had Aaron Banks was from California. But a lot of the great ones, the Martin brothers are from Indiana. Mike McGlinchey was from Pennsylvania. Quentin Nelson was from New Jersey. Liam Eichenberg, Tommy Kramer from Ohio. Robert Hainsey was from Pennsylvania. So there's been a lot of those kids that are local kids, and that it's an area where they still produce really talented offensive linemen. So Notre Dame's going to have to be strong. And you look at the projected offensive line in 2024. If you look at right now, the projected starting lineup right now, it's Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and either Arizona or Ohio. It could maybe be Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, Arizona, or Ohio, depending on who wins that right tackle job. So it is an area where Notre Dame still can recruit well, and they've been able to go into the Carolinas and get some talented players. So you have to be able to maximize and be good at your strengths as a program. Some schools can recruit certain positions they can just pick them out of their backyard. Okay, we need corners. Fine. There's 10 of them in our state that can play there. Notre Dame has to travel all over to find those guys. When it comes to recruiting offensive line, they're able to still get elite players in their backyard. And that's why it's so important to be there. But also the style of play that Notre Dame wants to play under Marcus Freeman requires that. So when Notre Dame goes into Texas A&M, they need to be able to have an offensive line that they can look at and say, this group has the talent. This group has the ability to play at a high level with consistency. But more importantly, this group has the ability to play with the tone, with the attitude, with the physicality that Marcus Freeman wants. And that is going to be the thing that ultimately tells us just how good this line can be, is do they have the talent, the attitude, the demeanor to be that tone-setting unit? And that's why I said when I started things off, to have an offensive line that can go on the road and just physically kick your butt is huge. I mean, you go into a first game of the season and maybe your pass game's not quite on the same page and you're working into a rhythm with throwing the ball and you're working into a rhythm over here and you're working into a rhythm over here and you're trying to figure this out. You're not quite sure which receiver is going to step up and who's going to be this or who's going to be that. But you know what you can do in week one? Go out there and play physical, nasty football. That's what you can do in week one. And that's where we're going to find out if Notre Dame can be that offensive line. And so when I think about this offensive line and we dive into where it is, I think the thing that I've noticed, and when I think of this line, and I believe that I think a lot of you feel the same way when we look at the chat. Whenever the offensive line is talked about, it's that great level of uncertainty, that there's an optimism from all of us that this line could be pretty good. We see the rankings; it could be pretty good, and then we look at it and say, "But man, it's an experienced group," and that's where you see a lot of that. How good is it really going to be? And how that gets answered as we look at the state of the offensive line and we look at the present of the offensive line. That's, I believe, why there's so much up and down in thought about just how good this line is going to be. So as we talk about the 2024 offensive line, and that's where we're going to begin today, the one thing that I do believe there's been some disagreement on when we talk about the 24 offensive line is how the spring went. And this has been a unique discussion point, because when I talk to people about the offensive line, or when I relay my opinion, I'll be honest, I was actually very encouraged by what I saw from the offensive line this spring. And I talked to other people and they're like, oh, it was struggled and all that. I'm like, well, I don't disagree that it had some struggles. But my thought is, but I expected them to have even more struggles. And the reason I think the offensive line it had a really good spring period is because the play wasn't always strong. And there's clearly issues that need to get worked out at right tackle, and left guard still needs to be figured out. But this offensive line also had some really good moments during the spring. But when you consider what it's going against, that's kind of what has me a little bit fired up about this offensive line this year, because there's no hiding. Like if there's any issue at all, it gets exposed. And I have an article coming out probably later today, maybe tomorrow, where I'm previewing the offensive line and breaking it down in written form. And it kind of pops in my head that it's not to the same degree, but what this offensive line is going against is sort of it's in a similar situation of what the 2017 defensive line was going against. Because I remember, and I know a lot of you will too, coming out of that 2017 spring and then into fall camp, I'm thinking, well, this D-line might be a problem, man. Like, I'm watching this offensive line just every single day just rip them apart. I mean, this offensive line just goes out there and they're ripping off big run after big run after big run. I mean, Josh Adams is a 50-yard touchdown waiting to happen in practice. Man, Dexter Williams is ripping them off. Tony Jones is getting out there and doing his thing. Like, Brandon Wimbush is doing his thing. And you're like, but it's D-line, because we're coming out of the Brian Van Gorder era, and we're coming out of the worst 3-year stretch in program history when it comes to stopping the run. And I'm thinking to myself, like, this is not going to be pretty. This is going to be a lot longer process than I thought it was going to be when it comes to this group getting better, because I'm watching them practice every day, every time we were at an open practice, and I'm thinking they are getting destroyed right now. And we're coming off of a season in which they gave up 182 rushing yards per game. Well, then you get out into the season and you realize, okay, the sources that I talked to at Notre Dame were onto something, because one thing that I was kind of told as we were having conversations with different sources at Notre Dame during that offseason was, no, the defensive line is going to be all right. The issue is this offensive line is just, they're dominant. I remember Mike Elko calling them the human lie detectors. He says, because if you're not bringing it, if you're not right, if you're not on your game, they will embarrass you. Like, they will embarrass you. And I don't think this Notre Dame defensive line is to that level of dominance, but there's no doubt this Notre Dame defensive line is very good. We're talking about a team that, in my opinion, last year, easily Notre Dame had a top 10 defensive line. We could debate, are they top 5? That's debatable. The interior of the defensive line is top 5. There's no doubt about that. They were top 5 last year, and everybody comes back. So, that'll be top 10. But, can the defensive end position perform to the level where they can be top 5? That's more of the question mark. But what we know is it's pretty good. The interior of the Notre Dame defensive line is very good. There's a lot of talent and potential on the edge at the edge positions. Josh Burnham had a very good spring. You've got R.J. Open, who's a veteran player, had a sack against Joe Alt last year. Jordan Patel's played a lot of football. Junior Talamaka's now played a lot of football. Bryce Young is an elite young talent. Boubacar Traore is an elite young talent. So this group is being tested. And so what I kind of had a similar opinion that some of you had when I watched the Blue Gold game, just kind of walking to my car and coming back, like, boy, there's some issues there, man. Tosh Baker really didn't play well, and this Joe Otting boy just got embarrassed on a play, and you just kind of get a little bit like, oh, that's a problem. Charles Jagusah got beat a couple times, and you're like, boy, that can't happen. And then I break the film down and I grade the offensive line, and what you realize is they actually played well. It's just when there was any kind of mistake, slow out of your break. Charles Jagusah had 2 plays where when he went to step out to an edge rusher, his feet got a little bit crossed up with his hands, and he didn't have a good technical pass set, and all of a sudden they run right by him. This defensive line will expose you if you make a mistake, and that's what we saw. So like Tosh Baker, for example, had 2 really ugly plays. But then you break the game down and you're like, outside of those 2 really bad plays, he looked pretty solid. Emil Wagner had a very solid game. Billy Schroff had a really good game. Christopher Tarrick had a really good game. Ashton Craig had a pretty solid game. Rocco Spindler was excellent in the scrimmage. Charles Jagusah, outside of 3 or 4 just bad plays, had some really good plays. And so you look at it and say, boy, they battled, and they weren't playing. The first team offensive line wasn't playing together as a unit. So, but this offensive line really battled. And now the question is, okay, great. You battled. You competed against the starting, the Notre Dame defensive line, which you expect to be very good. But that's fine. But that's not going to be good enough when we get to the sprint, to the fall, because you can't have those moments like that. Because guess what? There are some defensive lines that you're going to play during the season that when you make those mistakes can embarrass you. Texas A&M has one. Florida State's going to have one. Louisville's going to have one. Those are just off the top of my head. USC could potentially have one, depending on what DeAnton Lynn and Eric Henderson can do, developing what is a pretty talented Notre Dame or a USC defensive line. So you've got to correct those mistakes. But I do think going against that defensive line every day is going to make this unit better. So that's why I was actually encouraged coming out of the spring, but also saying, yes, I'm encouraged about where they are relative to where they started and relative to what my expectations were for the spring. But now, as a coach, you look forward to, okay, but is this good enough? And the answer is no, and everyone will tell you that. And that's true for most offensive lines right now that don't return 5 3-year starters up front. So now it's about, okay, what comes next? And I think that's really where we're going to have a lot of questions, because the progress was good, but it's just the beginning. The big steps now need to come in the summer and in the fall camp. And that's where we're going to find out, because we saw this unit play together once. Like, that's the thing sometimes that I forget is, we have seen this unit play together in a game. And that was the bowl game against Oregon State. And they went for 38 offensive points. I think it was 467 yards. And I believe 7.2 yards per play. Let me look at this real quick and just make sure so that I have this down. So yes, this unit played together. Yeah, 38 points, 468 yards per game or in the game, and then 7.0 yards per play. Still a very good performance from the Notre Dame offensive line in that game. And that was a Oregon State defensive line that kind of played. They only had one guy missing from their defensive line. They had guys missing from second and third level, but not the first level. She said, boy, they handled themselves well. Well, that's a great step. That's something that creates excitement about what this unit can be. But here's the issue. The counter to that is, yeah, but you had a month to prepare for that game. How is this line going to handle when it's only got 2 or 3 full practices to prepare? Those are much bigger questions. Now, maybe for the Texas A&M game, this line's able to play at a high level because they're going to have time to prepare. But then once they kind of get in the flow of the season, how good are they going to be? Are they going to be able to be consistent? Is this going to be an offensive line that just comes out and like just catches its stride at some point in time, game 2, game 3, game 4, and then just rolls? Or is this going to be an offensive line that looks a lot like last year's offensive line? Talented, but one week it looks like world beaters. The next week they look like they're mediocre, and then other weeks they look terrible. I mean, last year's offensive line was so on the spectrum of what offensive line play can be. I mean, there are some moments where you're like, boy, they played their butts off. They played really good football. You know, they absolutely dominated, some teams that we saw late in the year. They dominated Wake Forest. They dominated Stanford. I thought they were excellent against Ohio State and battled one of the best D-lines in college football last year. They were taking that game over in the fourth quarter, which is why people were so frustrated that they didn't run the ball more in the fourth quarter, is because the offensive line was starting to put in work. And then that same offensive line that looked as good as it did against Ohio State and looked as good as it did the week before against Central Michigan goes out against Duke and just stinks. Just physically got beat up, technically unsound, catching. I mean, it was a bad performance, and it wasn't any better than next week against Louisville. And then they get things right and start playing better against USC and playing better against Pitt. They were good in the first half against Clemson, bad in the second half against Clemson. And it was just that up and down performance that was so frustrating. And they did that with a relatively experienced offensive line. You had a 3-year starter in Joe Alt, a 2-year starter in Blake Fisher. You had a multi-year starter at Zeke Correll. You had new guards, but a lot of people had new guards last year. And to perform the way they did with a top 5 NFL draft pick at left tackle, a second-round NFL draft pick at right tackle, and then veterans inside, even though Rocco Spindler and Pat Coogan hadn't played a bunch, they were juniors. They weren't exactly puppies. And so to see that kind of inconsistency has to make you wonder, is it a talent problem? Was it a lack of consistency from a coaching standpoint, going from Jeff Quinn to Harry Hiestand to Joe Rudolph in a year? Did it take him some time to get kind of comfortable in Coach Rudolph's system? Those are all questions that we don't know the answer to. What we do know is last year's offensive line play was not nearly good enough. They had a great left tackle, and the rest of it was kind of inconsistent and struggled for much of the year. And that can't happen, which leads me to the point of when we talk about Joe Rudolph. The reality is for Coach Rudolph, this is a huge year for him. Huge year for him. And I'm not saying that Coach Rudolph has to have this offensive line playing at Joe Moore Award level. I think it would be unfair for me to expect that when you consider how much inexperience that this line has. And that'll be the next thing I talk about. But we need to see a big step with Coach Rudolph. Going into year 2 of your system, you need to be able to say, hey, they're going to take it to another level. When you look at Coach Hiestan's first year at Notre Dame, both times. In 2012, they went from okay group, lost some starters, lost Trevor Robinson, lost Taylor Decker. Braxton Cave's coming off of a bad injury. You come into 2012, and the offensive line takes off. They play way better, and they fuel the offense. His coming into his second stint at Notre Dame, they're coming off of a terrible season with the offensive line. Just to give you guys a little bit of a preview of what he inherited, I have the 2021 offensive line as the worst offensive line of the last decade. And so, the start for Coach Hiestand was rough. They got better and better and better, and still had a couple up and downs late in the year, but overall got better and better and better. And so to me, what we saw from Coach Rudolph, he did not have as good of a start at Notre Dame as Coach Easton had. And let's be honest, Coach Easton is the standard by which you measure it. But I also think he was into some unique circumstances with a new offense, third year with a new coach. I just think it was one of those things where you say, hey, there's some things I saw that concern me. There's some things that have to get addressed, but let's try as best we can to give him have an open mind and give him a clean slate in 2024 and see what he does. And so now it's about, okay, you've got a lot of talent coming back. Even the young players that are in your offense have now been coached by you for 2 years, where Joe Walt, Blake Fisher, Zeke Corral, they were in year one of being with you. Now even the Charles Jagasols, the Sullivan Abshers, the Sam Pendletons, the Christopher Terricks, the younger players, the Joe Ottings, even those guys who are true sophomores have only been with you. And so now you're going into year two, and you need to have that jump. You need to have that year two jump from Coach Rudolph. And the question is are they going to be able to have it? And whether or not that, how that question gets answered is going to tell us a lot about how this offensive line can play. So let's dive into the Notre Dame offensive line specifically from a player standpoint and where things are right now. And really what this comes down to is the success in 2023 or 2024 is going to be determined by what carries the day for Notre Dame when it comes to the line play. Is it going to be the talent or is it going to be the experience? Because that to me right now, there's a huge dichotomy between those two. When you look at this Notre Dame offensive line, there's one player coming back that has a full year of starting under his belt. That's it. And that's Pat Coogan. The next most experienced player on your offensive line has 10 career starts. The next most experienced player on your offensive line has 4 career starts. One of them was as a 6 tight end, and he played a series. He really only has 3 career starts, which is the same as your other 2. And your guy with 10 career starts is now moved over to left guard, where he's battling with the guy that has 13 career starts. So the odds are pretty good that your 2 most experienced players are not going to be on the field at the same time. So you're talking about a very young, inexperienced offensive line. And while that doesn't bother me at running back, it doesn't bother me at wide receiver, it doesn't really bother me at tight end, it doesn't really bother me at cornerback, it bothers me on the offensive line. It's a big concern. And it would be irresponsible of me not to at least discuss it as a potential stumbling block for this offensive line. And part of the reason is there's been some recruiting issues for Notre Dame on the offensive line. There were some issues where you look at the 2019 and the 2020 classes where your 5th years and potential 6 years are coming from. Your potential 5th year players were guys that were in 2020, that would be the 2020 class, are guys that it was 2-man class. One of them's already gone. The other was Tosh Baker. And you haven't seen that growth. In the 2021 class, obviously getting Joe Walt was huge, and you got Blake Fisher, and those guys panned out, but the rest of the class didn't really pan out. And it was a 5-man class. I believe it was a 5-man class. Yeah, I believe it was a 5-man class. And you don't really have a lot from that class that's stepping into the lineup this season. So the expectation for what your two oldest offensive linemen are, it's okay, Caleb Johnson didn't pan out. You've got Rocco Spindler and Pat Coogan battling for one spot, and then your 2 tackles went pro. And so recruiting woes plus some actual success with a couple of other guys has put them in a very unique situation where they're going to have to be young. They just don't have a lot of veteran bodies. There's only 3 players on the entire roster that are scholarship players that are either seniors or 5th-year players. That's it. And of those veteran players, they've combined for 26 career starts. That's it. It's not a lot. And so there's a woeful lack of experience on this offensive line. Here's the counter. This is an extremely talented offensive line, in my opinion, as well. Charles Jagasaw, 5-star player, showed his potential in the one start he had as a true freshman. The fact that he went into the spring not expecting to be the starter. I've talked to multiple Notre Dame people that going into that process and then coming out of that process, nobody really thought Jagasaw was going to go into it and earn the job. The start of spring, I was told it was Baker at left tackle and Emil at right tackle. That was the plan for the spring game. But he was so good that you had to play him. All right, that's awesome. That's great. He's still a true sophomore, right? But very talented player. You look at your center and your right guard. very talented players, Billy Shrouth, Ashton Craig, but they're young. They're redshirt sophomores with 3 career starts each. Your 2 veteran spots, left guard and right tackle, right now are the 2 biggest question marks on the offensive line in regard to who's going to start, right? I'm not as concerned about left guard from how it's going to play standpoint. I'll get into that in a little bit. Right tackle is a question mark. I don't know who's going to start, and I don't know how good the play is going to be. So when you look at the offensive line, there are those questions, but man, there's a lot of talent there. I mean, even Tosh Baker's a former top 100 player. Emil Wagner's a guy with a lot of potential. Sylvan Absher's very talented. Your entire sophomore class is really talented. And the one guy that I wasn't super high on coming out of high school, Christopher Tarrick, played really well in the blue gold game and is already well ahead of where I thought he would be coming into Notre Dame. And then, of course, you got a group of true freshmen that has another 5-star offensive tackle in Gerby Lambert and 3 other talented players in Styles Prescott, Peter Jones, and Anthony Knapp. So I really like the talent of the offensive line, but as I said, it's young and inexperienced. And for an offensive line, that can be kryptonite. So as I said, your talent is way over here. I don't know that there's 5 offensive lines in the country that have just the God-given. Now, when I'm talking talent here, I'm talking about just God-given physical talent, not talent combined with experience that relates to what the production is going to be. That's a different conversation. That's the important one. I'm simply talking about from a God-given talent, the high-level talent up here, the depth of talent throughout. You're going to have third stringers at Notre Dame this year. There's going to be at least one third stringer at Notre Dame this year that I'm going to look back and say, that guy probably starts in the 2021 offensive line. That's how deep they are. But again, the depth is all young. And that's kind of where we're at, where the question is. So while the talent is over here, the experience is on the complete opposite spectrum. It's hard to think of them being less experienced. But then I come back to the middle ground and say, but we saw this line together. We saw this line push Oregon State around. And so you get that, boy, I'm not sure, but you saw the potential in the bowl game. And those are the things that are going to have to carry the day. And that's why I say this is such a big year for Joe Rudolph, because it's up to Joe Rudolph to get the most out of this young group and bring them together in a hurry. And the faster he can do that, the better he's going to this offensive line is going to be. And that's why it's a big year. So let's talk about the talent. And to me, Jagasol is important, but here's truly to me where the key is for this offensive line. And Jagasol is part of it, but there's one at the top, and that is the center right guard combination of Ashton Craig and Billy Shrouth. When you look at how they performed late last year when they were thrust into the starting lineup, there were what you'd expect, some ups and downs from such a young duo, but the ups were really good, and there was a lot more ups than I thought. If you go back and look at the Notre Dame offense, and I'm not talking what the team did, I'm talking just the offense, and you look at how they performed in the last 3 games of the year with Shrouth and Craig in the starting lineup, because if you remember, Rocco got hurt against Clemson, Zeke got hurt against Clemson, and those 2 kids got thrust into the lineup because of injury. How did they perform? Well, in the last 3 games, the Notre Dame offense, just the offense, scored 44 points per game. They averaged 479.6 total yards per game and 7.4 yards per play. The Notre Dame record for yards per play since the end of World War II is 7.0, and I'll show you that later. They averaged 7.4 yards per play. And the run game was okay in the first game against Wake Forest. It wasn't great. They didn't rely on it a whole lot, had some moments. But in the last 2 games, the Notre Dame offense rushed for 615 yards in the last 2 games. Let me make sure that my math is correct on that. I'm doing this in my head. So it's 381 plus 236, 617 yards in the last 2 games. So in the last 2 games with Billy Shrouth and Charles Jagasol, the Notre Dame offense averaged 308.5 rushing yards with this young group, right? So when you watch them play against Stanford and Oregon State, they both played pretty well. They've got to take that next step. You did get some experience under your belt. So yes, they only have 3 career starts, but they're the most recent starts. They got the whole offseason as the guy, right? Notre Dame didn't play that game with Billy Shrouth like, oh, you gotta earn it, so we're gonna rotate. they said, hey, you've got to earn it, but we're going to give you that shot to earn it. They put him out there with the number one group during the spring, left him out there and said, let's see if he sees it or not. And Billy sees it to the point where they moved Rocco Spindler to left guard, despite Rocco having a pretty good spring. And so he took that step. Ashton Craig took another step to where now you say the foundation is laid. You're going to have a veteran at left guard. Whoever that's going to be, you're going to have a veteran at left guard. I expect the left guard position to be better. And so when I look at the interior of the offensive line and I think of that battle at left guard, because there's going to be a battle left guard, I've said it before, don't need to rehash it a bunch, but it fits in with this conversation, which is when you look at the interior, and I'm going to bring up the depth chart now so you guys can look at it while we're talking about this. So when you look at that left guard battle, you've got Pat Coogan, who started 13 games last year, Rocco, who started 10 games last year. And when I look at the left guard position, I've said this before, I fully expect I don't know who's going to be starting a left guard. I don't know how good the left guard position is going to be. No clue. But here's what I am confident in. The left guard position is going to be better in 2024 than it was in 2023. Why do I say that? One, if Pat Coogan's still the starter, the expectation is that he's going to be better than he was last year because he now has more experience under his belt. No matter what you feel about Pat Coogan, barring injury, there's no real reason to think he's going to regress from where he was last season. I would argue he's kind of reached his peak as a physical talent. I don't see Pat Coogan getting any better from a physical talent standpoint. But what he can do is improve the technical parts of the game that come with experience. Those things, to me, are where I see Pat Coogan being. Here's the other option at left guard. He gets beat out by Rocco Spindler, which then raises the bar even higher. So either way, I expect there to be an improvement at left guard. If Rocco beats out Pat Coogan in the spring or in the fall camp, then you're going to be in a situation where, boy, that could be a really dominant interior. And so when I talk about the key to the offensive line, it's twofold, but it's all up the middle. And you guys have heard me say this a lot. This isn't going to surprise anybody that's been on this channel for a while. Yes, tackle's important. But as a coach, I've always felt that the thing that can hurt us the most as an offense is if we're not good up the middle. Because if you're okay at tackle, but you're inconsistent or young, there's things I can do. I can slide protection. I can chip the tight end. I can put the back over there. There's a lot of things I can do. I can put a tight end in Max Pro. There's a lot of things I can do to protect a tackle that's maybe not a great pass blocker. If I'm not good up the middle at center guard, there's nothing I can do. We're just going to get beat. We're just going to get beat up the middle. So now what I have to do is completely alter my game. I have to move the pocket. I have to get outside the pocket. I have to do play action. I have to do all these type of things that hinder my offense. And when you look at Notre Dame's offensive line next year, while there are major questions, I can't help but kind of get a little bit excited about what this interior offensive line could be if Ashton Craig continues making strides and if Billy Schrauth is the guy that I think he is. Because when I think of Billy Schrauth, and I think of, what can Billy Schrauth be when he's reached his full potential? I mean, he's a day 1, day 2 draft pick, in my opinion. At the very least, day 2. He's an NFL talent. And we started to see flashes of that last year. And then I look at Rocco Spindler, and I'm like, boy, when I look at Rocco's first year as a starter, there's some ugly snaps. Ugly snaps. I still kind of just shake my head when I think of the snap against Duke where he just fell down because he tried to go from left to right. But then I think about Rocco's first year as a starter, and I'm like, boy, there were some moments where he was dominant. I mean, he just would bully people, just destroy people off the line. Well, what I loved about the spring game performance was Rocco had more dominant moments. You go watch the first touchdown run. He blew somebody. I mean, he was dominant at times. But the difference between Rocco in the spring and the Rocco that we saw in the fall of 2023 is that the blue gold game version of Rocco was also steady. Can he carry that into the season? If he does, to me, that's how this offensive line gets maxed out up the middle, is if Rocco beats out Pat Coogan. But even if he doesn't, I still expect there to be an improvement up the middle because of what we talked about. So, Billy Schrauth is only going to be a redshirt sophomore. Ashton Craig's only going to be a redshirt sophomore. Well, one of the concerns and issues that Notre Dame had last year is that Rocco Spindler and Pat Coogan were going into the season and they were redshirt sophomores. and they performed like you expect a young player to perform, which is very inconsistent and overall just not great football. Well, there's a couple reasons why I don't think we're going to see a repeat of that when it comes to Ashton Craig and Billy Schrauth. And the big reason for that is last year going into the season, so Pat Coogan played 769 snaps last year, according to Pro Football Focus. Do y'all know how many snaps he played prior to last season? Snaps, not games, snaps. He played 3 snaps on offense in his career. When you look at Rocco Spindler, who played 559 snaps last year, in 2 years, he played 19 snaps. So the 2 offensive linemen that Notre Dame had to count on last year as redshirt sophomores to step in and be key contributors and to help carry the line had a grand total of 22 career snaps. That's it. So you're going to have some inconsistency. So, okay, well, what's different about Ashton Craig and Billy Schrauth? Well, number one, I would argue the talent level's better. I think Billy Schrauth, in my opinion, is more talented than Rocco Spindler, although you all know I like Rocco as a player. And I think Ashton Craig is certainly more experienced than what Pat Coogan was. But here's the biggest difference. Experience. As redshirt freshmen, Billy Schrauth and Ashton Craig both got over 200 snaps last season. The duo last year combined for 495 snaps. So as redshirt sophomores, Rocco Spindler and Pat Coogan are taking over starting jobs with a combined 22 career snaps. Ashton Craig and Billy Schrauth, as redshirt sophomores, are stepping into a lineup where they have more career starts than what Pat Coogan had snaps, 6-3 going into the season. They combined for 495 snaps. So the starts numbers are low, 3 each, but they did play a lot of snaps last year. And when they were on the field, they performed well. And that, to me, is why I actually have a lot of excitement, because even though there's some question marks at tackle, to me, when you look at the interior of the offensive line, that's how you expect it to really thrive. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that can be, because I feel if you can be good up the middle, that's going to make it easier on your tackles. That's what kind of has me a little fired up about that, is that interior. So let's talk about the tackles, though, because they're very important. And if they're very good up the middle, see, here's the thing. I said the interior to me is more important. But here's the reality. If the interior is really good and the tackles they stink, then you're not going to have a very good offensive line. If the interior is dominant and the tackles are solid, then you're going to have a pretty good offensive line. If the tackles play well, that's where you have a dominant offensive line. And so the degree to where the tackles play is going to go a long way towards telling us how good this group can be. And when it starts with Charles Jagasaw, I think the bowl game was a great experience for him, because Charles realized, I'm a big bag dude. I'm 6'7", I'm 330 pounds, but I'm going against men now. I'm not in high school, beating up on kids that are 100-plus pounds smaller than me. And the first play of the game, he comes out and gets knocked down. I mean, just literally gets knocked to the ground by an Oregon State defensive lineman. And I think it was 2 plays later, he got knocked down again. But he settled in after that. And it was kind of like, okay, welcome to college football, kid. And you watch him play, he just got better and better and better as the game went on, to the point where you're like, okay, this kid's got a chance to be something. This kid's got a chance to be a really good football player. And he comes out in the spring, and he's going to have some ups and downs, of course, because because remember now, this was Charles' first spring. He's only been at Notre Dame for 2 semesters. He was not an early enrollee. And so I think you're going to see a big jump from him, but they're going to need that. They're going to need him to be a little bit more consistent. Look, guys, I'm going to prepare you right now. Okay. For those of you those of us that were spoiled by how good Joe Alt was as a true freshman, how steady Joe Alt was. Joe Alt's from a different universe than Charles Jagasaw and every other elite Notre Dame offensive lineman, in that you cannot dismiss the fact that he was raised by a guy that was a 10-plus year NFL starting left tackle who's in the Kansas City Chiefs Hall of Fame. That put Joe ahead of the curve, so to speak, from a technical standpoint. It allowed him to play consistently. Now, what made him a dominant player wasn't that. Joe is an elite player because of his God-given talent, his work ethic, and those type of things. I'm simply talking from a consistency standpoint. Growing up in the home of John Alt is going to put you ahead of the game. Now, Charles didn't have that, but they don't need him to be Joe Alt, because I would argue that at the same age that we're going to see Charles Jagasaw have an opportunity to be an even more dominant player than what Joe Alt was as a freshman. And that's going to be the thing where you're going to lose some of the consistency, but what you're going to gain is an elite talent that's going to be more dominant at times to me than what Joe was. That doesn't make him a better player. It just means he was more dominant. And that to me is going to be the key to how good Charles Jagasaw can be, is how consistent can he become? For his age, yes, but how consistent can he become? And that's going to be something that I need to see. Now, when you talk about what Charles Jagasaw can do, part of the reason that I really want to see Rocco Spindler take over at left guard, and this is going to sound like an anti-Pat Coogan thing. It's really not. I think Pat's a relatively steady player. He's a tough kid, hard-nosed kid. He's just not very powerful. And that's really the limitation. Like, I could deal with Pat Coogan not being overly athletic because he's an okay athlete. I don't think he's all that athletic, but he's not like a bad athlete. But if you're going to be that, you better be dominant, physically dominant. And Pat's not. He's smart. He's tough. He's a great kid, but he's not dominant. Now, with Rocco is not a very great athlete. Like, I don't have not to speak English. Rocco's also not a great athlete. He's got some issues he needs to work through. But what Rocco has is when he's on, he is dominant. He is physically dominant. And we saw that at times last year, and we saw that in the blue gold game. If you can put a 324-pound Rocco Spindler next to a 329-pound Charles Jagasaw, and they're both playing, Rocco's earned that job, but Charles earned that job. You're talking about a Notre Dame offensive line that's going to have a left side of the offensive line that's just going to be very big and physical and nasty. And so to me, that's also part of the reason why I want to see Rocco take that job. But Charles, to me, is going to be a strong run blocker in 2024. The question is going to be, what does he do from a pass pro standpoint? That's where a lot of his inconsistency comes, and that's where Charles will have to get better. And if he can do that, then I think he's going to have a chance to be a really good football player now, not down the road, now for Notre Dame. I'm going to interject a little point here real quick, just a little heads up. So we are getting some really bad storms right now in the South Bend area, and my internet's kind of going a little bit in and out. Hopefully we'll be okay. I'm going to keep this thing rolling, but if for some reason I go out, I'll try to get back in. And if for some reason I don't come back after a couple minutes, then that means that the internet's down and I don't have a way to get back in. But I will do my best to keep this thing rolling. Those are just one of those things that are out of my control. It hasn't happened yet, but I want to at least warn you guys, just in case we see that happen, that that's what's going on as we get started here. So just want to give you a heads up on that. So just give me 1 second, and I'm going to dive back into the right tackle position. All right, got to deal with something here real quick. We're just trying to get Sean Stiers good to go here, because he is getting ready to publish a story about the Notre Dame men's basketball team. Landed a big guy today. So since we're talking about big men, it makes sense that that we go there and get that done. So just give me 1 second. Just got to get all that started, and then I'm going to publish this for Sean, and we'll be all set and get back to talking about some offensive line. So sometimes, guys, when it's me doing the solo show, I got to put on one of the other many hats that I wear and get this thing going. So just published that. Notre Dame is, as I said, got a big, or I say literally a big pickup today. Not just 9 some points, 5+ rebounds or so, 6 rebounds or so. So it gives them some depth down in the post. Let's get back on track and let's get back on the offensive line. We talked about the left guard battle. We talked about the importance of Shrouth and Spindler. We talked about Charles Jagasaw. Those things are open because those things are important for many reasons, but also the better you are there, the less you're going to have issues if you struggle at right tackle. I don't believe right tackle is the kind of position where if it's not great, it just kills everything. Because, like as I said earlier, there's things that I as a coach can do to protect my right tackle if that's a weak spot for us. You're going to be hard having an elite offensive line if you have a weakness anywhere. But I think back to 2017 versus 2016. With pretty much the same offensive line, the 2016 offensive line really struggled at times and was very up and down. The 2017 offensive line was phenomenal. Well, what was one of the differences? You had four of the 5 guys were the same stars from the year before. Well, in 2016, you had issues at right guard, and you had multiple guys start there. You had a lot of inconsistency. There were times when the play at right guard was just downright bad. So even though McGlinchey and Nelson were second or third team All-Americans that year, played good football, Mustipher was good. I thought Alex Bars was good at right tackle. Your offensive line will still struggle at times because your right guard position was bad. I mean, it was bad. And it wasn't really until I think it was Mark Harrell kind of stepped into the lineup late and somewhat settled it down late in the year that the offensive line really started to play at its best. Well, then you fast forward to 2017, and what they do? They slid Alex Bars inside to right guard. And then at right tackle, you've got a redshirt freshman in Tommy Kramer and a true freshman in Robert Hainsey that had to handle that spot. And they were solid. They weren't special. They were solid. They did their job. But you could protect them at times with where you ran the ball, how you ran the ball, using your tight ends to get an extra hat on their side of the line. You were able to do things to help protect the quarterback with them, with movements, with chipping with the backs, with the tight ends. There were just a lot of things you could do to help the right tackle position when you needed it, but they were good up the middle because moving Alex Bars to right guard completely solidified the interior of that line. So you're really good at left tackle, you're really good up the middle, and so you were able to have the best offensive line in college football despite being just kind of solid at right tackle. Well, that's kind of what they need from this unit. I don't expect this unit to be as good as 2017. That's not the point. The point, however, at least is not as dominant as 2017. The point, however, is that if you're good enough from right tackle to left tackle, you can do and you're just okay at right tackle, you still should have a pretty good offensive line. And I think that Notre Dame's at least going to be okay at right tackle. I don't think they're going to be bad at right tackle. And the reason I say that is because there's just too many options, too many quality options. If Tosh Baker just plays every game like he did against Oregon State, he's just solid. That's it. He's solid. It's nothing special. He's just solid. But if he's solid and the rest of the offensive line is really good, guess what? This offensive line is going to be really, really good. If you look at it from the standpoint of Emil Wagner, I mean, he's going to have some ups and downs. His lack of size is going to be an issue at times. But if he's, shows the upside of what he can be, then he's got a chance to be at least solid. And if Emil can be as steady as he was in the blue gold game and carry that forward, he may have a shot to beat out Tosh Baker. And if we get that steady version of Emil, then the offensive line is going to be really good because he'll have some more. I think Emil has a chance to have more dominant moments. Like Tosh, I expect to just be kind of steady, right? That's what I'm hoping to get from Tosh. Just be steady. Just go do your job. Just don't make mistakes. Be what a fifth-year senior is supposed to be. Assignment correct, technically sound, give max effort. Just do your job snap after snap. That's what I expect. Right tackle, to me, you look at it and say it could be dominant at times if Emil or even Sullivan Absher win that job. And that's where it gets interesting. So I don't really care, but with those two, you're going to lose some of that steadiness. So who needs to start at right tackle? I don't care. But here's the key, and you all know what I'm going to say on this one. It's not about who wins it. If Tosh wins it and he's just steady, I'm good. If Emil wins it and he's steady with moments of dominance, or Sullivan wins it and he's steady with moments of dominance, I'm good, even if they're not quite as steady as Tosh could be. But what it has to be is whoever starts has to win the job. And I've explained this before. There's a difference between a guy earning the job because he's the best of the group that's there, and a guy that's won the job. And what I mean by that, and when I use those words, is earning it means, hey, you, of all the guys, you did the work, you performed the best, and you're going to start. That doesn't necessarily mean he's good. A guy that wins the job is the guy that goes out there and earns it. Says, hey, you went out there, you took hold, you played at a high level, you made it your job, right? Billy Schrauth this spring went out and said, this is mine. He won it. Charles Jagusah went out in bull prep and won the job. He didn't get slid in there just because he was next in line, or of the guys that were there, he was the worst, or he was the best bad option. He won it. That's what you want. When Robert Hainsey played as a true freshman in 2017, it's not because they had to play him. It's because he was too good not to play. And that's going to be the key, whether it's Tosh Baker or Emil Wagner or Sullivan Absher or Gerby Lambert. I don't really care who it is, as long as it's one. Somebody steps up and says, this is mine, and I'm going to play in a way where this is mine. That ultimately could be the final piece to this being a good offensive line that's clearly a top 10 unit, or this being an elite offensive line that by end of the season could end up being a Joe Moore award-winning unit. I'm not quite sure that I think the offensive line is going to get there, because there's way too many ifs and questions and youth. However, when I look at it, I start getting excited about, okay, but it doesn't mean that they can't play like this at times. That's what I want to see. Is I know that you're not going to be the 2017 offensive line week after week after week. I know that. I know this offensive line is not going to be one that's as good week to week to week as the 2015 offensive line. I know that. Now, if it does, I mean, great. I'd love to be shocked, but I don't expect that. It's too young. I mean, look at the depth chart I'm just showing you guys. You've got a redshirt freshman, a redshirt sophomore, and a redshirt sophomore in the starting lineup, and there's a chance that you could have a third redshirt sophomore in the lineup. There's a chance that you could have a second redshirt freshman in the offense in the starting lineup. It's going to be young. That's the key. It's going to be young. So I don't expect the experience of the 2015 offensive line, for example. Ronnie Stanley was a senior. You had Quentin Nelson was young as a redshirt freshman, but your center, Sam Mustipher, was a senior. Your right guard, Alex Bars, was a senior. No, this was 2015. So Nick Martin was your center. He was a fifth-year senior. Your starting right guard, Steve Elmer, was a true junior that had been starting since his freshman year. And your right tackle, Mike McGlinchey, was a redshirt sophomore that had started the year before. So you had some youth, but the veterans that you had been there for a while, right? And so you had some of that steady play. But even then, you saw some ups and downs at times in that 2015 unit. The 2017 unit is the one where you really had the most experience. Mike McGlinchey was a fifth-year guy. He was experienced, three-year starter. Quentin Nelson was a three-year starter. He was a senior. Sam Mustipher was a senior. Alex Bars was a senior. And then at right tackle, you had a redshirt freshman and a true freshman. But you had a ton of experience everywhere else. And that was the thing that you saw from that unit. This unit is going to be a lot younger and a lot less experienced. So I don't expect them to play that way every week. But they need to have moments where you see that. Moments where, holy moly, I can't wait till this group gets more experience. And then the other part of it, and this is going to be up to Coach Rudolph to make sure that he gets it to this point in time, is limit the down moments to a series, a snap, a play here and there, not a whole game or a stretch of the season. No, I don't expect them to look like the 2017 offensive line against Boston College or Temple or NC State or USC from 2017 every week. Maybe they have some performances like that. Maybe they don't. Maybe they're not quite that dominant. But we need to make sure that we don't see next year is no Duke games, no Louisville games, no Clemson second halves. That's got to be gone. That's got to be a thing in the past. That's got to go. And that's where Coach Rudolph is going to have his success. And then the final piece to this for me is, as you can see here, guys, there's a lot of depth on the offensive line. And we talked about Jagasol a little briefly about Sullivan Absher. I think has loads of talent. Coogan and Spindler. We talked about Ashton Craig. We talked about Billy Stroud, Christopher Tarek, Tosh Baker, Emil Wagner. Didn't even get into what I saw from, I talked a little bit like Tarek. Didn't even get into some of the really good stuff we saw from Sam Pendleton. Snapping has got to get better. But, man, when he's right, that guy can move people. I thought Joe Otting played really well in the spring game outside of one bad snap where he just got beat by a bigger guy. Styles Prescott, to me, has loads of talent. Anthony Knapp really impressed me in the spring game. Gerby Lambert's a 5-star player coming in. So, and heck, even the walk-on kid, Robbie Wallen, who's going to be a walk-on from Kansas, that kid's a scholarship player at some schools, and so to me, I look at it like this and say the depth of talent creates a wider margin for error, which then leads me to even more confidence that this unit is going to be good. So that's kind of where I see this group. And I'm actually going to hold off on the floor versus ceiling debate until we get into the ranking of the offensive line, because this part of it went a little bit longer than I expected. So this is kind of the look at the 2024 offensive line. We're going to kind of look at the future here in a little bit later. So I'm actually going to mix it. You know what? Let's just stay on track and we'll keep this rolling. But when we get back, I'm going to talk about the future of the offensive line and why, no matter how you feel about the 24 offensive line, the future is incredibly bright for Notre Dame, and that's certainly something to be excited about. So we'll talk about that next on the Irish Breakdown podcast. All right, so we spent a lot of time on the present of the Notre Dame offensive line because it is vitally important to the 2024 season. I don't know how good it's going to be, but I can say this: I'm excited for the future because this offensive line is young and very talented. And we've seen some of the things we don't know about Joe Rudolph as a coach. He has certainly has answers as a recruiter. And so when you have a conversation about the present and your concern is, boy, I love the talent, but they're really young. When you project to the future, it's where you really can get excited because you don't have to focus as much on the inexperience because, right now I look at it and I say, man, boy, Notre Dame goes into the season and Jagasol's only got one career start, and Ashton Craig and Billy Stroud only have 3 career starts, and heck, even Coogan and Spindler only have 1 season worth of starts. Tosh Baker's only got 4 career starts. One of them was a tight end. Emil Wagner's not really played any meaningful minutes. Like, man, this is a really inexperienced group. Sullivan Absher hasn't played really any meaningful snaps. Sam Pendleton, Christopher Tarek, like, man, I don't know, man. There's a lot of question marks, and you don't want youth in the offensive line. Well, fast forward a year from now, right? Fast forward to post-spring of 2025. We're going to be talking about Charles Jagasaw, again, barring good health, Charles Jagasaw having at least 14 snaps under his belt, at least. We're talking about Billy Stroud and Ashton Craig having at least 16 snaps under their belt. That right there gets that group over 40 career snaps. Tosh Baker can't come back, but if Emil Wagner starts or Sullivan Absher starts, they're going to have a full season or at least a partial season under their belt. You're going to look at the left guard position, whether it's Pat Coogan or Rocco Spindler. One of them, whoever wins that job, is going to have 20-plus career starts under his belt. Absher is going to be in the program a year longer. Pendleton is going to be in the program a year longer. Tarek, Wagner, Otting, Jones. And you start to look at the talent and you start to say, boy, this offensive line, the youth now doesn't become a youth problem anymore. And you look at it, and I could say this. It's funny how what you're talking about can change your perspective. Because I could say this to you, guys, when you look at the 2024 season, Notre Dame is going to have 13 offensive linemen that only have 2 years or that have 2 years or less of college time under their belt. Like that is concerning. 13 of their offensive linemen haven't been in college for 2 years or less. That's troubling. Okay, let's shift to 2025. Guys, going into next season, Notre Dame is going to have 13 offensive linemen, not including incoming freshmen, that are going to have 3 or more years of eligibility left after this season. That's where you start to get excited. But then you think about that group, and a lot of them are going to get more time this season. And so you start to get excited about, okay, if they can make strides this year and show some progress, next year's when we should be talking, if Joe Rudolph is the coach we all hope he is, next year we should be going into the offseason saying, the way this team finished, what we saw is, and somebody said it, let me find out who it was. It was Jason Smith said, by November, experience won't be an issue. I would say, yeah, it still kind of will be. It won't be as much of an issue. But to your point, Jason, whether it will or won't be an issue in November, or if we were to say, okay, it won't be an issue like it is in September, but what degree is it still an issue? We could have that discussion. But what you and I are now absolutely simpatico about, my friend, is when you start talking about where we are a year from now, when we're doing our offseason overview of the offensive line a year from now, we should be talking about a unit that by November started playing at a higher level, that started showing its potential in November and then into the postseason. And that's where you start to get really fired up about what this group can be, because as you guys can see from the depth chart right there, that way, look how many guys. So I have it broken down by class and eligibility. Freshman, sophomore, freshman, sophomore, freshman. There's 2 juniors, 1 fifth-year guy. That's it. So the future is incredibly bright on the offensive line. And if Joe Rudolph's the coach that we think he is, Notre Dame could begin another stretch of elite offensive line play in 24 that really takes off in future years. And we started to see that at times a little bit in 2014 with Harry Hiestand, but it really started in 2015 where we started to see that offensive line really start to take off under Coach Hiestand. And they had 2 stretches like that. 12 and 13 were very good. 14 was a bit of an up and down year because they had lost some great veterans and the recruiting had been a little bit, up and down. And then 2015, the guys that Coach Hiestand recruited and developed were starting to dominate the lineup, and that's when they took off again. Well, the thing that Joe Rudolph has going for him is he has a year of, even before he got here, the foundation he inherited was not Jeff Quinn's coaching, it was Harry Hiestand's coaching. And he has a full year of Coach Hiestand recruiting under his belt. Jagasol, Absher, Pendleton, Otting, and Tarek were all guys that Coach Hiestand recruited, and then even some of the incoming freshmen are guys that Coach Hiestand laid that foundation. So that does give Coach Rudolph a little bit of an extra leg up than where Coach Hiestand was when he took over in 2012, and then where he took over again in 2022. And so, yes, the expectation should be that Coach Rudolph can keep this thing rolling. And so, yes, people ask, is there pressure on Joe Rudolph? Absolutely, there's pressure on Joe Rudolph. So let's look at the future, and here's just what's there to like about the offensive line moving forward, just beyond just the cliche, oh, they're talented. Okay, here's a couple things that I notice when I look at this offensive line. Overall, number one, they're just getting a lot bigger. I think the size of the offensive linemen are just overall bigger, more 320 plus pounders. Even a guy like Billy Schroth, who's listed at 306, and Ashton Craig's listed at 308. You just look at them; they look bigger than Zeke Correll, even though that they were listed at the same weight. They're just bigger bodied players. So I think they're a lot longer. I mean, 6'7", 6'7", 6'6", 6'5", 6'5", 6'5", 6'4", 6'4", 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", 6'5", 6'5", 6'8", 6'6", 6'4", 6'6". And then the 3 commits in the 2025 class, 6'6", 6'7", and 6'8". So they're certainly getting a lot bigger. There's a lot of talent. But let's dive into more of the specifics. One of the big issues that Notre Dame was having, especially during the Jeff Quinn era and coming out of the Jeff Quinn era, was the interior of the offensive line. What Coach Hiestand did a great job of was finding guys who could make smooth transitions inside. Notre Dame had a couple guys do that. Jarrett Patterson did that. But some of the recruiting misses that they had, turning down Zach Zinner, like I heard a story. This is from a pretty good source, that Zach Zinner visited Notre Dame. It was really Notre Dame or Michigan. And the offensive line coach basically said to Zach Zinner that, we like you, but, Tosh Baker's our number one guy. And that kind of pretty much screwed Notre Dame over. And my response was, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just tell them, we love you, we love Tosh, we want both of you? Notre Dame passed on Wyatt Milam. Go look at any preseason All-American list or any list of top 10 offensive linemen coming back in college football next year. Wyatt Milam's a guy that you all remember. I love that kid coming out. Now he's at West Virginia. He's an All-American. Why? Because Notre Dame slow played him. There was a lot of issues where they were not taking the numbers or the type of players you need to not only be good at tackle, but then be really strong inside. And the interior of the offensive line has been really up and down in recent seasons, really up and down. Well, when I look at the offensive line in 2024 and then project it forward, I think the interior of the offensive line has a chance to be elite moving forward. I mean, you've got Spindler and Coogan who are veterans, but after that, you've got Craig, you've got Pendleton or Shrouth, who are very talented players. I love the rising sophomore class with Pendleton, with Odding, with Tarek, and I still view Sullivan Absher as an interior player down the road. In a perfect world, there comes a day where Charles Jagasaw and Gerby Lambert are starting at tackle, and you've got Sullivan Absher starting somewhere inside at guard. Let's say when Rocco Spindler leaves and you slide Sullivan Absher in their left guard, and you guys see that list right there. For those that are watching at home, you can't see it. I'll tell you what it is. At left tackle, the number one and two left tackles are Jagasaw and Absher. Jagasaw's listed as 6'7", 329. Absher's listed as 6'7", 325. Imagine if when Rocco Spindler's time at Notre Dame is over and you slide a Sullivan Absher left guard, if that's the starting left side of your offensive line. That's really, really good. So I think the future of the offensive line inside is much stronger than it was. And that was really something that Coach Easton played a big role in getting going from a coaching standpoint, but also from a recruiting standpoint. Tommy Reese did a great job of landing Billy Shrouth, who they would not have landed if the previous offensive line coach before Coach Easton was still there. Just he wasn't going to go play for him, from everything I've been told. Coach Reese helped land that, but then Coach Easton came in. He got Christopher Tarek. He got Sam Pendleton. He got Sullivan Absher. He got Joe Odding. So the future of the interior is much stronger now. And that's important because it wasn't really strong before. That's why you had to go to the portal and get Kane Madden, and that's why you had to move certain guys around, and just the inconsistency of that interior was a problem. Well, then you get into the last few years, and recruiting at tackle has been a little bit shaky. And Coach Easton had to put in so much work to repair the interior that at times the tackle position was a little bit thinner. There were some issues that they had recruiting before Coach Easton got back. The Joe Walt, Blake Fisher group was great, but how many years now? Last 2 years? Are we talking about the depth behind Alton Fisher being problematic? Well, now you're in a situation where is Charles Jagasaw left tackle? I don't know. Is there really a pure left tackle on the roster? I don't know the answer. I don't know that there is. But you look at the talent and you say, okay, they've been very thin at tackle. And going into 2024, they're very young at tackle, and that's a problem. There are projected seven tackles on the roster when you include Gerby Lambert. 7 projected tackles. 5 of those 7 have freshman eligibility in 2024. And another has sophomore eligibility. What does that mean? It means they haven't played much football. It means we don't really know what they can be. So there are some questions to me at tackle. But even at tackle, I think you're seeing an ascension, and I think you're seeing it bounce back. I think getting Charles Jagasaw was huge for Notre Dame. It's a big win for Coach Easton. Getting Gerby Lambert was a huge win for Coach Rudolph. I had my doubts about whether or not Anthony Knapp could play tackle. I think he might be able to now. Love the pickup of Styles Prescott. And then, of course, you look forward to the 2025 class, and you have 3 guys that have a chance to play tackle. Now, not all of them will. Somebody's going to have to move inside the guard. But what you've done is the combination of Coach Easton and then what Coach Rudolph has done has really restocked the depth chart. So while it's concerning in from the standpoint of you're so young in 2024, but it's excited to think about what they're going to be in 25 and beyond because of the work the 2 of them have done in restocking the depth chart. And when you think about the future, one of the, with Joe Rudolph, there's 2 questions when a new coach comes to Notre Dame, especially one who's never coached at this level. Wisconsin and Pitt, with all due respect, are not Notre Dame. It's a different animal. Can he coach can he coach at a championship level? Can he recruit at a championship level? We don't know the answer to the coaching one yet. We don't. There's some things I saw that I like, but there's definitely some major question marks. I'm not saying Joe Rudolph won't be a great coach in Notre Dame. What I am saying is we don't know if he can be a great coach in Notre Dame from a development standpoint. He's been here 1 year. We don't know. Let's see how he does this season. However, when you look at the recruiting standpoint, this is an area where he has absolutely checked the box, in my opinion. Look, I have no problem taking credit away from Joe Rudolph and giving it to Harry Hiestand if that's what is deserved. I also have no problem giving Joe Rudolph the credit where he earned it. And as I said about the 2019 offensive line class, I felt that the position coach who signed those kids got way too much credit for landing them because Coach Hiestand had already laid down the 2019 offensive line class. Coach Hiestand had already laid that foundation before he left. It was just don't screw it up. When Coach Hiestand left the second time, Notre Dame was in a little bit more of a precarious situation in certain areas. They already had Peter Jones in the class, and Styles Prescott was in the class. But you had to you had Peter Jones in the class, and you led for Styles Prescott. You were the perceived leader for Gerby Lambert, but both of those guys, it was still very early in the process for both of them. And so you weren't in the same situation that Coach Hiestand left Jeff Quinn from the standpoint of just don't screw it up. Joe Rudolph had to put in work to finish off with Styles Prescott. He had to put in work to keep Peter Jones. He had to put in work to get Gerby Lambert. That he deserves yes, Coach Hiestand laid a foundation, but Joe Rudolph had to put in major work to win those battles. And Ohio State came hard for Gerby Lambert. And he also went out and found Anthony Knapp. I still have some questions about Anthony Knapp, but I'll tell you, he's already ahead of where I thought he would be. And I'm excited about what he showed. Then you fast forward to 2025, which is the first full class for Joe Rudolph, and I think he's done an excellent job. You went out and beat national program after national program to land Owen Strebig. You went out and beat Michigan. Now, you didn't beat a lot of national programs for Will Black, but what you did is you beat the defending champs for Will Black. You beat a team that has won 2 of the last 3 Joe Moore Awards for Will Black. That is big. And then, of course, getting Matty Augustine, who also was being recruited by Michigan. So the one thing that I believe we can say confidently about Joe Rudolph, we don't know if he can be a great coach. Hopefully he can be, but there are no more questions about whether or not Joe Rudolph can recruit at a high level. He has absolutely shown that. And here's the thing, if he can coach well, if he's the coach we hope he is and just puts a good product on the field with the talent he had, or just does a good job coaching with the talent he has, he's going to put a great product on the field, in my opinion. And then that makes it that much easier for him to coach or to him to recruit. And so that's why when I think about the future of the Notre Dame offensive line, you start kind of getting a little fired up about what it can be moving. I'm excited about what it can be at 24, but when I start getting to thinking about 25 and beyond, boy, that's where you start getting really excited because the offensive line is going to be big. It's going to be relatively athletic for its size, pretty athletic for its size, actually, relatively athletic, period. And there's just tons of potential and upside. So I think the future of the offensive line is very high, and I think it's a very exciting place to be. You have Owen Strebig, who's a top 100 player in my view. You have Will Black, who I have as a top 250 player, but 2-on-3 has him ranked as a top 10 national player. And you have a guy in Matty Augustine that Notre Dame was able to go land, and you look and say, well, he's a 3-star kid. Nobody has him ranked as a 4-star, and that's true. But then you look at the schools that Notre Dame had to beat to land him in February. He had offers from Alabama, Florida, Miami, Michigan, Nebraska, Ohio State, Penn State, Stanford, Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Wisconsin. So he had to go out and land some dudes, and he landed some dudes. He had to beat some top programs to land those dudes, and he did it. So just another reason why the youth of the roster, the ability of Joe Rudolph to go out there and recruit at a high level, and if we're being honest, again, we don't know what kind of coach Joe Rudolph is going to be at Notre Dame. But if all he is the same coach he was at Wisconsin, he was a solid coach at Wisconsin. The very minimum, a solid coach. You could argue a good offensive line coach at Wisconsin. He had some very good offensive lines there. So I'm not worried he's going to be bad. It's just, is he going to be elite? That's really the question. Just so you all are clear of what I mean by that. Is he going to be elite? That we don't know. But the future of the offensive line at Notre Dame is very bright. So certainly something to be excited about. So we're going to move on to some more fun here after this, and we're gonna rank the offensive lines. But before we do that, folks, do me a favor: hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. If you're listening via podcast platform, whether that be our partners at Spotify or Apple or whoever else you listen to, we would greatly appreciate a 5-star review. And if you've not done so, sign up for the message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. I put a big Irish Breakdown business update on the board and what that's going to mean for premium members here moving forward. But there's a lot going on right now that I'll have more to say on in June, but I did have an update on it on the message board. I'm excited about where things are going. We'll see how it all shakes out. There's going to be some ups and downs, but I'm excited about where things are going, and you can learn all about that on the message board as a premium member of boards.irishbreakdown.com. All right, let's get into part 3 of today's show. And this is meant to be fun. We're going to have a little fun in this segment. And we're going to talk about the past Notre Dame offensive lines and then tie it a little bit into the present of the Notre Dame offensive line. And so as I was thinking about this, I was like, okay, was kind of planning for today's show, and I want to talk about the offensive line, and I'm not sure what I want to do film room wise. I'm not sure what I want my second topic to be about, and really the third topic is we talk present and then future the offensive line. And and a lot of times people will ask questions of the chat, say, hey, how would you rank this and how would you rank that? So I was like, you know what? Let's have a little bit of fun with this. Let's rank the Notre Dame offensive lines of the last 10 years. And so I'm going to give you my 10. Kind of explain why I think those groups should be where they are. But I also want to hear your 10. So I don't want to hear you guys, going into this and saying, hey, Bryan, we want to hear your 10, and I'll give you mine, trust me. But I want to see what you guys think. I want to see what you guys think about what your ranking is, but I also want to hear what you guys think as far as what you think of my list. So what I'm doing is I'm ranking the list based off a criteria of, number one, just watching the film, who was the most dominant, getting into production. Obviously the production is going to factor in the talent of the lines. So it's really trying to look at it as an all-encompassing thing. It's not just about numbers, but obviously the numbers tell a certain part of the story. The film tells a certain part of the story. The talent is going to tell a certain part of the story. Some lines put up good numbers against great competition. That impresses me more than putting up great numbers against crap competition. And one offensive line in particular had some truly brilliant moments against some really good defensive lines, but it didn't quite. It was one of those units where it just didn't quite, in my opinion, play to the consistent level as it needed to, especially late in the year. So I'm going to rank my offensive line. So let me ask you guys this in the chat. Would you guys rather me go 10-1 or 1-10? I was going to go 10-1 and start off with my 10th lowest group first and then work up to number 1. So that's what I plan on doing, unless some of you object. So if nobody has any objections, we're going to rank the last 10 offensive lines from 2014 to 2023. We're going to rank those offensive lines. I'm seeing the responses in the chat. You all are saying 10-1. So we're going to do it. Let's go 10-1. The 10th offensive line, I thought this was an easy one. I think it was number 10 by a mile, and that is the 2021 offensive line. And what I'm going to do during this is I'm going to kind of bring up some numbers to kind of show you guys the production that I view when I'm looking at an offensive line. So when you look at those numbers, just so we're clear, the first group is points per game. That is offensive points per game only. So I removed any defensive touchdowns, any defensive safeties, any special teams touchdowns. If the special teams took over at the 2 and the offense punched it in, I give the offense credit for that. But I took out all points that are directly related to the special teams or the defense. So this is offensive points per game only if some of those numbers don't look familiar to you. Then total offense, point yards per game, and then yards per play. Rushing yards per game, yards per rushing attempt, and then sacks per game, or total sacks plus lost yardage from sacks plus total sacks per game allowed. So that's sort of the data. When I think of numbers, that's the data that I look at and say, that's what you can look at from the offensive line and say the offensive line is playing a role in this specific number. If you average 425 passing yards per game, obviously the offensive line can't suck, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how good it is or isn't. How many sacks you give up to a degree can tell you that. What you do rushing yards per game and yards per attempt can do that. And then, of course, points, it's part of what everybody does. So that's my criteria. So 2021 is my number 10 group, as I said before. When you look at the 2021 offense, what's interesting is they actually have one of the better points per game averages. But here's why I said earlier, I don't care that you put up a lot of points against teams that stink. And the reality is the 2021 offense put up a lot of points against teams that stink. And, you're talking about a schedule where Notre Dame played one team all year that ranked in the top 25 at the end of the year, and only two teams that were ranked when they played. Wisconsin was ranked when they played, and the offensive line played terribly in that game. And then Cincinnati was ranked in the top 25, and they didn't play very well in that game either. So the fact that they went out and put up a bunch of yards against teams that aren't any good, this really doesn't mean anything to me. The film was terrible. They were inconsistent. They got pushed around. They padded stats against teams that aren't any good. North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia Tech, teams that again, they're just not very good football teams. But they went out that year and just consistently beat up on bad teams and got worked by good teams. Only had 242 yards of offense against Wisconsin. That's it, 3.5 yards per play. Only had 341 yards of offense and 4.61 yards per play against Cincinnati. Really the only two good teams they played all year. And they 526 against North Carolina, whose defense was terrible. 514 against Georgia Tech, whose defense was terrible. 510 against Stanford, whose defense was terrible. Those were just not good football teams, especially on defense. In 2021, North Carolina gave up 32 points a game. Stanford gave up 32 points a game. Georgia Tech gave up 33.5 points per game. So I don't care that you perform well against them. I care that what you did in the big games, and that offensive line was terrible in those big games. And to Andrew Gilmore's point, they were bailed out by the skill talent, whether it be Jack Cohn at quarterback bailing them out, whether it's Kevin Austin with some big plays, but primarily by Kyron Williams. You think of the North Carolina game, Kyron Williams has a 90-plus yard touchdown run in that game. But do y'all remember that play? He got hit by three guys in the backfield. It's a terribly blocked play, but Kyron just made a phenomenal play on it and was able to go the distance. So 2021 worst offensive line of the last 10 years. 2014 is my second offensive line, second worst offensive. So it's number 9 of the last 10 years. And what's interesting is I thought the offensive line actually had some really good moments, but like a lot of the other lines in the bottom is they were down below. And so, or they were too inconsistent of the groups below. They were way too inconsistent. And when you look at that offensive line and you think about the high moments, right? You think of the performance against Rice, who was not very good. You think of the performance against North Carolina, whose defense was bad. I thought the offensive line played their butts off against against Florida State. But then they were really not good against Arizona State. They were very up and down against Northwestern. They got kind of beat in the trenches against Louisville. They got beat in the trenches against USC. They were very good against LSU, but that was with a new look offensive line. So that's just not what we saw all season. So I was back and forth between 14 and 16 for this number 9 spot, but I went with 2014 because I just felt like the up and down performance of the team was really had a lot to do with the up and down performance of the offensive line. And where I felt like the 2016 unit, which is next for me at number 8, to me had a little bit more steady play than what we saw from 2014. So when you look at the 2014 offensive line compared to the 26 offensive line, the 2014 team scored more points. They had more yards, but the yards per play were identical. The 2016 offensive line had more rushing yards per game, more rushing yards per attempt, and the sack numbers were the same. The 2014 offensive line gave up fewer sacks per game because 2016 played less games, but the 2016 offensive line gave up 38 fewer sack yards. And a part of the sack numbers being higher was because you had dual threat quarterbacks in Deshaun Kaiser and Malik Zaire that are going to run into some sacks that aren't necessarily on the quarterback. And that's okay. That happens with those type of players. You live for you live for that. You don't live for it, but you live with it when you have those type of players, because it's going to happen. And so to me, I put 2016 right ahead 2014. All right. Timeout. Green Man is officially gone. I can't deal with that anymore. So I tried to be kind and nice, and he's gone. I can't deal with that anymore. Give me a second. I'm curious how you guys have the bottom three. I am curious about that. I would like to see, how do you guys have 21, 14, and 16? Where do you guys have them on your list? So let's keep moving. Number 7 on my list is the 2019 offensive line. Now, I'll say this. There's a bit of a gap to me between the bottom 3 and the top 7. And then there's some gaps within that. But I think the 2019 offensive line, to me, was significantly better than the 16 or the 14 offensive lines. And you still had a little bit of that, he stand recruit group left. And you look at the points per game, and obviously Chip Long and he stand got along very well, and they kept a relationship during that time. But look at the points per game. 34.6 is the second highest of all this group of this entire tenure. Look at total yards per game is pretty good. You look at the yards per play is pretty good. The rushing numbers were better, set 179 and 4.9. You had you look at the sacks, the lowest amount of, tied with 2023 for the lowest amount of sacks total and sacks per game. And so if you look at it and you say, well, the numbers look pretty good, why was that unit lower? Why was that unit 7th on your list? Well, fair question. And there's 2 reasons why. Number 1, their other offensive lines were really good. And number 2, the issue I had with the 2019 offensive line is I felt like they were that unit that feasted on bad teams and then got dominated by the couple good teams they played that year. I mean, if you look at the numbers, obviously a lot of yards against Louisville wasn't very good. A lot of yards against Bowling Green, USC. A lot of yards against Duke, who wasn't any good. Boston College, who wasn't any good. You out-athleted an Iowa State team that wasn't very good. Your performance as an offense was very erratic. And your ability to run the football was also very, the total numbers are a little bit misleading. You had some big performances. USC, you had 308 yards. You had 288 against Duke. You had 252 against Boston College. But as I've pointed out in the past, those teams weren't very good. Those teams weren't very good stopping the run. Duke gave up 180 yards per game that year, from a rush defense standpoint. USC gave up 162 yards per game that year from a rushing standpoint. They just weren't good running teams. I mean, the 2 weeks before, Notre Dame went for 308, Washington went for 193, and Utah went for 247. Fresno State rushed for 206. You beat up on bad teams is what it comes down to. Your points per game is higher because you blew out a New Mexico team that stunk, and a Bowling Green team that stunk, and a Navy team that wasn't very good, and the Stanford team was 3-9. And you look at what they did in the two. They only played 2 good teams really all year from a defensive standpoint. You played Georgia and you played Michigan. And in those 2 games against Georgia and Michigan, Notre Dame rushed for a combined 93 yards. Combined. 46 in one game, 47 in the other. 46 against Georgia, only 3.3 yards per attempt, and 47 yards against Michigan at 1.5 yards per attempt. So the only 2 good teams you played really all year, you got dominated. Not only were you not good, you got dominated. And I can't have an offensive line in Notre Dame rank in the top 5 in a decade when you get dominated by two bad teams. The only 2 good teams you play, and you dominate a bunch of bad teams. So to me, when I look at that and say, boy, the numbers for 19 looks pretty good, it's that right there. It's the fact that they did it against bad teams, which is why they rank so low on my list. The next one is, for me, is 2023. And again, now we're starting to get into, close to the bottom, the end of the bottom five and the top five. And there's a little bit of a gap between five and then, or number 6 in the top 5. The 2023 offensive line, again, the numbers look great. 35.9 points per game, more than any other offense in the last decade. Yards per game to 43.2. You only had what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 offenses that ranked higher than that. Your 7.0 yards per play was second in the last decade. Notre Dame's 23 offense was about 6.95. And then the 2015 offense was 7.02. So even though it rounded to 7.0, they were below the 2015 unit. Running the football, third best yards per attempt of the last decade, behind the 2017 to 2015 lines, ahead of the 2020 offensive line, 185.7 yards per game, tied for the lowest amount of sacks and the lowest amount of sacks per game. So why is this offensive line 6th in the last 10 years? Well, 2 reasons. Again, they padded stats against bad teams. And when I look at this offense this year and you think about how the offensive line played in some of the big moments, you say, okay, well, they played really well against Ohio State. And I would say, yes, they did. They definitely did. But that was the only big game where I thought they played well. I didn't think they played that well against NC State. They had one great play coming out of the break where they opened up an 80-yard touchdown run for Audric Estime. The other 36 carries of that game, they only ran for 90 yards. That's it. One 80-yard run, and then the other 6 carries were for -3 yards per attempt. Right? Sam Hartman was getting harassed. He was getting hit a lot that game. If you think of one of the big plays of that game was a busted play where Sam Hartman scrambles out. Chris Tyree gets knocked down. He gets up, gets free behind the line. Hartman finds him for a big play. You weren't playing well. You weren't playing well in that game. And we saw that all year. We saw this offense go out there this past year and just dominate against inferior opponents. Dominated Navy, dominated Tennessee State, dominated Central Michigan, dominated Pitt, dominated Wake Forest, dominated Stanford, dominated Oregon State. They played one of the worst performances I've ever seen from a Notre Dame offensive line against Duke. I believe I said at the time, I haven't seen a game that bad by Notre Dame offensive line since 2007, in my opinion. And so, yeah, the Ohio State game was great. You could argue between 22 and 23. We could have that conversation. And 22 is my number 5 offensive line. But to me, the reason I have 22 higher is because I feel like that offensive line had to carry that team. The 2023 skill was better. They were better, way better quarterback. There was a lot better outside. What you had on the offensive line in 2022 is they had to carry that team in completely. I mean, when I think about what that team did in 22 against Clemson, for example, say, man, that is just, you just don't see that very often. You don't see a team that can throw the ball against a team like Clemson with that defense that can throw the ball for 85 yards and blow them out and run. Clemson knew what was coming and couldn't do anything about it. Notre Dame's 23 offensive line did that to like Stanford, Central Michigan. But think about this. So when you look at the 22 offensive line versus the 23 offensive line, you say, well, the 23 offensive line averaged 0.7 yards more per carry. It's impressive. They only were 3.4 fewer yards. Okay, also impressive. And so to me, when I look at the play, say, well, the numbers look great. Their sacks are close. Yards per play way down. So why do I have the 22 offensive line ahead of the 23 offensive line? Well, the context of it is, in my opinion, is the 23 team got by on a lot of talent, playing a lot of bad defenses, and the offensive line didn't have to carry the team. They did some of that stuff at times in spite of the offensive line. When I look at the 22 offensive line, if they didn't play well, they couldn't score and they couldn't do anything. And they had a far more consistent performance. Let me give you some numbers. So you say that yards per game are similar, right? But in 2023, the Notre Dame offensive line had 4 games with over 200 yards rushing. Actually, hold it. Yeah. In 2022, the Notre Dame offensive line had 7 games with 200 yards or more. And when you consider, number one, I think they played some tougher defenses in 2022 than they did in 2023. They certainly played more ranked teams in 2022 than they did 2023. And the fact is they didn't have Sam Hartman and the pass game that they had this past year to bail them out. So the numbers should lead one to 2023. And that's fair if you want to go with 2023 more. And I'd be curious what you guys think. Who would you have ahead, 22 or 23? But when I break down the film, when I think about what was asked of that 23 offensive line, and then when I consider what they were overcoming for what they were the year before, 2022 was coming off of the 2021 year where they had the worst offensive line. We all agreed it was the worst offensive line, whereas 23 was overcoming an offensive line that had been built up. And so I asked myself this question. If I had to go win a game and say, okay, I can take the 22 offensive line or I can take the 23 offensive line, no other context, quarterback, running back, skill talent, no other context. I got to go win a game, and who am I taking? I'm taking the 2022 offensive line over the 23 offensive line. Just flat out. And somebody in the chat had said the 23 offensive line had 3 coaches in 3 years. Okay, but that to me is not an argument for the 23 offensive line because Coach Easton in 22 was having to overcome the terrible foundation that was laid by 2021 by Jeff Quinn, whereas the 23 offensive line was building on that foundation. So again, and I'll put it like this, name me a time in 2023 when the offensive line played better than it did against Clemson in 2022. Name me a time in 2023 that the offensive line played better than it did against North Carolina or BYU or Syracuse. Name me a time when the offensive line played better than they did in those games or against South Carolina. Name me a time in any point in time in 2022 that the 23 or in 2023 that the 23 offensive line played as well as the Notre Dame offensive line did in 2022. Now, am I taking the 23 offense over the 22 offense? Absolutely. But I'm not taking the 23 offensive line over the 22 offensive line. I'm not. It's just, it was a better unit. Number 4 for me is the 2018 offensive line. I think that was a very good unit. It was an interesting group that you could make a case higher. And again, I haven't seen anybody put their top 10s in there, but I want to see your guys' list. At least give me your top 5 at this point in time because I want to see who your top 5 are. 2018 is next. I thought that offensive line was good. I thought that they played a tougher schedule than what we've seen in recent years. You played Michigan at the beginning of the year, was very good. Northwestern was a good team that year. Syracuse was a 10-win team that year. You played a great Clemson team in the postseason. You know, that Pitt team in 2018 wasn't a great team, but they had a very good defense, very salty defense that year. Stanford was a 9-win team. They were better than what we've seen. And when you look at the numbers, too, I think the numbers were stunted a little bit by the early season struggles that I don't think were as much about the offensive line as they were the quarterback. And so when I look at the 2018 offensive line, I see a group that averaged over 30 points per game. You know, the yards aren't great, but if you look at what the yards were after the first 3 games, it tells a little bit of a different story. So when they made a change at quarterback, that really started to boost the performance of the offense. And so when I look at the offensive line, I just don't think that they were the reason they struggled a little bit. I mean, I think of the first game of the year and they don't have Dexter Williams. They don't, he's out. Brandon Wimbush is a quarterback. I actually think Brandon did some good things in that game, but you're playing with Jafar Armstrong and Tony Jones as your top 2 running backs. Jafar Armstrong was a converted wide receiver. And you're going against a Michigan team that year would not lose another game until they played Ohio State late in the year. And your offensive line goes out there and just really plays well against a very good Michigan defensive line, a very good Michigan defense, and leads you to victory. And then you go out and you struggle offensively against Ball State and Vanderbilt. But again, I don't think that was because of the offensive line. I mean, I thought they ran great against Vanderbilt. But if you look at the play of the offensive line, when they made the change at quarterback, then you look at what their numbers were the rest of the year. So as you can see from the numbers that I have there, you look at the offense and they averaged 6 yards per play. It's not great. 440.1 yards per game. That's solid. 182.6 rushing yards per game. You know, that's not bad. But when you look at what they did in the final 10 games, after they made the change at quarterback, they got a lot better. In the last 10 games of the year, they averaged 462.5 yards per game and 6.3 yards per play. And I thought the rushing was also more efficient late in the year. And I just felt that offensive line battled. And I know some people disagree with this, but when I go watch the Clemson game in 2018, and that was against an elite Clemson defensive line, I thought the offensive line held their own. I think the issues were more at quarterback. And once the Clemson realized that Ian Book was not going to throw the ball down the field, they started loading the box. But I thought early, first play of the game, Notre Dame's offensive line just took Clemson and just drove them 10 yards down the field. I thought they battled their butts off. I just didn't think that the quarterback helped them a whole lot. So that's my number 4 offensive line. My top 3 were where I had a little bit of a, okay, I'm not sure how to rank these necessarily, but here's where I'm at. I went number 3, 2020 offensive line. One of the arguments I made for having 22 over 23 is that the offensive line had to carry the team. And you could argue that there was only one other year where the offensive line had to carry the offense and the entire team as much as the 2020 offensive line. You know, you had a veteran group. You had all the turmoil of that year with the COVID situation, canceling spring ball, summer workouts. You get basically get a month where your season stops for almost a month because of a COVID outbreak and all these other things and travel restrictions. And it was just a chaotic time. But the one steadying presence for Notre Dame that entire time was to play the offensive line. And I've said this about 2020. I thought that was Brian Kelly's best coaching job ever, to just go wade through all the craziness that was that year and go out and have a 10-0 regular season. At the end of the day, I really felt the offensive line was a big reason for that. You know, they were physical, they were consistent, they were steady. You know, they just went out and handled their business and just, running the football 178, 281, 353, 232, 227, 208, 274, 199, 283. You know, they didn't run the ball well against Pitt. Numbers wise, 115 yards. But if you remember, that Pitt team was an elite rush defense, and they were loading the box. Pitt only gave up 93 yards per game that year, 2.7 yards per attempt. And Notre Dame, that season rushed for 115 and went for 2.3 yards per attempt. A lot of that, if you also remember, was they had some garbage moments late in the game where they had pulled their starters and were trying to run the ball. But the way that they played it is they gave Ian Book a lot of time to throw the football, and he ripped Pitt up. Just ripped him up, threw for over 300 yards, and they blew that game out in the second half. So I thought they played well. I thought they battled against Clemson in the ACC title game up front. I think, again, they had some issues that were more related to the quarterback not getting the ball where it needed to get to, and then the defense falling behind than it was to play the offensive line. I thought the 2020 offensive line was really, really good. And, to wade through all the drama of that year and still average 31.7 points per game, 448.5 yards per game, 6.2 yards per play, 211.1 yards per game was the third best, actually second best of this entire 10-year stretch. 5.0 yards per carry was fourth best. 2.1 yards per sack, or 2.1 sacks allowed is in your top 5 or so best performances. It was just a steady line that just brought it every week and was a tone setter every week. And for me, that's why I ranked the that 2020 offensive line number 3. And I think you could make a case that it should go higher, but I'm not, because I think those next 2 lines were special. Now, let's get into my top 2 offensive lines. And this is where I think a lot of you are going to maybe disagree with me. And I'm curious about this because the perception is the 2017 offensive line's the best offensive line Notre Dame's had. And I'll say this, 2017 was absolutely the most dominant offensive line that Notre Dame had, not only in the last 10 years, but I would argue in the last 30 years, probably going all the way back to, probably 93 or even earlier. Dominant offensive line. You're talking about a team that the rush number still to blow me away. 422 yards against Temple, 515 rushing yards against BC, 182 rushing yards against a Michigan State defense that year finished second in college football in rushing defense, only gave up 95 yards per game and 3.4 yards per carry. Notre Dame in that game went for 182 yards rushing averaged 4.6 yards per rush. And if you remember, didn't have Tony Jones to start the game. Josh Adams gets hurt in the first quarter. Dexter Williams gets hurt in the third quarter. Tony Jones is already out. And you spent the last half, quarter and a half of that game with Deion McIntosh as your running back, and you were still running the ball on Michigan State. That was a dominant performance by that offensive line. 333 against Miami of Ohio, 341 against North Carolina, 377 against USC, 318 against an NC State defense where their starting 4 defensive linemen all got drafted in the 4th round or better, and their starting middle linebacker was a 3rd-round pick that started on the Bengals. Here they went to the Super Bowl, and then 380 against Wake Forest. Just dominant offensive line. All-Americans, Quentin Nelson, unanimous All-American, Mike McGlinchey, consensus All-American, Alex Bars was brilliant in 2017. I thought Sam Mustipher had the best year of his Notre Dame career in 2017. Tommy Kramer had his best year at Notre Dame that year. Robert Hainsey was steady. Just a great offensive line. More than any other team in yards per rush, 6.3. Highest yards per game by over 50. Sacks were right problem. We'll get into that. But here's the reality of why I can't have the number one. Number one, we're comparing 2 great lines. They're both brilliant. So which brilliant line are we talking about? Here's the 2 knocks for me on the 2017 offensive line. Number one, they didn't finish well. Now, I don't think all of it was their fault. They had, McGlinchey was a little banged up. The pass game was just non-existent. And they just kind of faded down the stretch a little bit. Partly not on them, a lot of it not on them, but they just didn't finish well, in my opinion. The other part, too, is they played better against Georgia than a lot of people think, but they didn't play great against Georgia. And they didn't play great against Stanford. And that, to me, those are 2 of the bigger games that you played. And I put a lot into big games, right? So 2017 was really, really good, but there's a number on there that to me is a little bit misleading. And when I look at the 2017 season from a sack standpoint, that 17 team gave up 30 sacks. Now, when you consider how infrequently Notre Dame threw the football, that 30 sacks is actually a pretty high number. And part of that is on Brandon Wimbush. I mean, he would take sacks he shouldn't have taken that year. However, the only criticism I've ever really lobbied against Harry Hiestand was I felt at times his teams were too aggressive in 2017, and then that would result in some issues in protection. Some people said 17 Miami. I actually don't think the line played terribly against Miami. The team played bad. The offense played bad. The offensive line battled against a pretty good D-line, but they didn't play as well as they should have. That I'll agree with, and that's part of them just not finishing well that year. But the inconsistent pass pro, the poor finish to the season, or I should say poor, the substandard performance in the season is why I have to go back and say, okay, 17 is great. Should have won the Joe Moore Award that year and did win the Joe Moore Award that year, but they can't be number one. And my number one offensive line goes to the 2015 offensive line. I think it was without question the most talented offensive line that Notre Dame's had. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But when you think about the play of that offensive line throughout that season, there's other years that had better numbers in certain areas. I mean, they didn't finish higher than 2017 in points. They were higher in yards per game, higher in yards per play. They were less in yards per rush attempt. But here's really what it comes down to for me, why 2020 is better. Or 2015 is better, excuse me. Elite talent. I mean, Ronnie, think about this starting offensive line from left to right. Ronnie Stanley, Quentin Nelson, Nick Martin, Steve Elmer, Mike McGlinchey. That's big time. But here's the other thing to think about. When you look at the numbers from 2015, let's put them in some context. Your starting quarterback gets hurt in the third quarter of the second game of the year. Starting quarterback out for the year. Your starting tailback gets hurt on his 3rd carry of the season, out for the year. Your starting tight end gets hurt in the second game of the year, doesn't come back till like late November. And you went into that season with the rest of that year without your starting quarterback, without your starting tailback, without your starting tight end. Your tight end gets replaced by a true freshman. Your starting quarterback gets replaced by a redshirt freshman that almost quit football. He was so bad in the spring. And your starting running back gets replaced by a converted wide receiver who never played running back before. The last time he carried the football, he went for a 50-yard touchdown. It was on a jet sweep as a receiver in the bowl game to end the previous season. And then the two running backs after CJ Prosise were two true freshmen, Josh Adams and Dexter Williams. So when you put that context into play of the 2015 offensive line, which I thought also played a tough schedule, because 17 and 15 both played tough schedules. But when you look at the rushing offense that year, 214 against Texas, 253 against Virginia, 215 against Georgia Tech, 457 against UMass, 214 against USC, 299 against Stanford. And that was a really good Stanford team. And I thought the offensive line more than held its own against Ohio State that year as well. I thought the 2015 offensive line and the 2017 offensive lines both had to carry those teams in a big way. But I think the 2015 offensive line was more consistent. I think the 2015 offensive line was as dominant in a dual threat way as the 2015 line or 17 line, which had more dominant rushing performances. But I think 15 was more steady. 15 was better in some bigger moments. Like, they didn't run the ball great against Clemson, but they gave DeShone Kizer all the time he needed in the second half to rip Clemson apart in the second half. I thought they were brilliant against Stanford, who was a top 5 team. I thought they played well against Ohio State, who was a top 5 team. I think consistency of the 2015 offensive line. I think the talent of the 2015 offensive line, the context of what they had overcome that season. No, lose your starting quarterback, lose your starting running back, lose your starting tight end. Your starting running back is replaced by a converted wide receiver. The other two, the depth of the positions, all freshmen. There was so much working against that football team. You had Brian Van Gorders, your team's defensive coordinator. That also hurts them. So I just look at it and say, I just love the performance of the 2015 and 2017 offensive lines. But I'll say this, if I had to go win one game, I'd probably pick 2017. But if I had to say which unit can get me to that one game, I'm going 2015. And so to me, that's ultimately what did it for me and why I took the 2015 offensive line over the 2017 offensive line. But 15, 17, 20, 18 were all excellent offensive lines, talented offensive lines, a lot of NFL players, and fun to watch. That's the other part of it too. Now, we're going to wrap it up with this. The 2024 offensive line, where will it finish? What's the floor and what's the ceiling for the 2024 offensive line? Floor for the 2024 offensive line is this for me. It's a unit that has moments of really good play, but is inconsistent. It's an offensive line that doesn't have the lows of last season, but also doesn't have the highs of 2015, 2017, 2020, those type of seasons. So the floor for me, and I'm very curious what you guys think of this, because as I sat and thought through this, I think the floor for me for 2024 is between the 23 and the 2019 offensive line. That's the floor. I contemplated going between 22 and 23, but I think we have to be honest about the fact that there is a chance that the 2024 offensive line could be not as good as the 2023 offensive line. I think it's slim, but I think it's at least possible that it could be there. So I think the floor is between 23 and 19. I think the more realistic of where I kind of project them to be is actually between 22 and 2018. That's where I project it to be, is between 18 and 22. So floor is between 23 and 19, which would be 7th on this list. The realistic expectation of kind of where I think they will be is 5th between 18 and 22. But what if they reach their peak? I'll say this. If this offensive line reaches its peak, I think the best that they can do is 3rd, ahead of 2020, below 15 and 17. I don't think there's any scenario where I see this offensive line being better Now, the offense can be better. Talking about the offensive line, where the offensive line can be better than 17 or 15. But I'll say this. If by the end of 2024, we are talking about this line even being in the conversation with 18 and 20, when we projected the 2025 offensive line, if this line grows to that degree, then next year we're going to be talking about the 25 offensive line having a chance to be on the same level as the 15 and 17 offensive line. And that's why I say there is a lot we're going to learn about Joe Rudolph. If he can get this offensive line to play anywhere like 18 to 20, then that's going to tell me he's going to answer some of those questions about coaching, and he's going to take it to the next level in 25, and that's where I start getting really excited. So that's going to do it for this show, guys, and this is also going to do it for the entire show. I was going to try to do a film room today, but with that storm outside, my internet's really shaky right now. So when I was trying to look at some film a little bit ago, it was not crisp and clean, and so I'm not going to be able to bring that up and play that. It's just going to be too blurry. It's going to be hard. I have a feeling it's going to be just a tough session to get through, and not really enjoyable. So I'm gonna do that another day. So no film room today. I'll probably try to do one Wednesday or Thursday, just so we can make sure we get a film room done today. But with the way the internet is right now in this storm, and hey, you know what? I thought we had 2 hours of great conversation. I enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And we'll be back again tomorrow with more great conversation. But with the internet being the way it is, let's just go and wrap it up. But I hope you guys enjoyed talking all Notre Dame offensive line. I enjoyed it. I love talking offensive line. I'll be back tomorrow, 2:00 tomorrow is when you'll find me again. We're going to have some more Notre Dame team breakdown. We're going to talk DB recruiting with my guy, Bryan Smith. And then, of course, we'll have our buy, sell, and hold. So, Salty, buy, sell, or hold tomorrow, man. So go do what you got to do. Get that up on the board, and we'll get that rocking and rolling for tomorrow. So buy, sell, hold. And Bryan, the goal is for Bryan to do the buy, sell, and hold with me, which will be a lot of fun. But at the very least, it'll at least be me, but he'll be on there to talk recruiting. Tonight, IB Nation Sports Talk. Sean Stiers and the guys will be talking tonight. And then, of course, tomorrow they'll be back on it too. So Sean had to take off yesterday to deal with some family stuff, but we're back on. IB Nation Sports Talk is back on tonight. And for the rest of the week, we'll be back on the rest of the week. Going to be a lot of fun. So everyone have an awesome rest of your day. Thank you all so much for joining me. Hit that like on your way out. Hit the subscribe. Hit the notification bell. If you've not done so, sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Show your support for Irish Breakdown by signing up for the message boards if you've already done so. Have an awesome rest of your day, everybody, and I'll talk to you again soon on the Irish Breakdown podcast.